Hi everyone, I'm Ms. Regina Regala, a language and literature teacher from Xavier School, and this is video commentary on the language use in the short story Hills Like White Elephants. The short fiction text for analysis is called Hills Like White Elephants, published by Ernest Hemingway, considered one of the greatest American authors of fictional works in both the short and long form. His stories and novels seek to portray a spectrum of subjects, from the mundane like boxing, fishing, and bullfighting, to more serious topics such as the effects of war on individuals and their relationships with other people. Hills Like White Elephants is a story that thrives on a conversation that we, as readers, are allowed to eavesdrop on. And as mere spectators and or listeners of the dialogue between a young girl and her older lover, a man, obviously, an American, we find that they are deliberately skirting serious issues. It seems that this girl was impregnated by accident and that this very conversation will determine the fate of their unborn child and, in effect, also the fate of their relationship. Given that the story is largely driven by dialogue, it seems ideal to utilize Roman Jakobson's communication model, also known as the Jacobsonian communication model, as a framework for analyzing particular portions of the text. This model allows for an opportunity to nitpick at the communication functions, and, as in all functioning systems, is made up of certain components. 6 to be exact. The first component is the sender, the one that sends the message. Next, the message, what the sender wants or needs to say. Third component is the receiver, that person or individual who receives the message sent by the sender. The fourth component is the context, the circumstances, and even the setting that necessitates the need for the sender to send the message in the first place. The contact, that instance or venue wherein the sender and the receiver are present for a communicative act to take place. And lastly, the code, how the sender sends the message to receiver. And for this commentary, we aim to use this very model to demonstrate how context determines the language use of a character in the story to convey a particular message. With this goal in mind, an application of the Jacobsonian communication model does seem ideal, especially in the earlier portions of conversation between the girl, named Jig, and her lover, the American, particularly when the title of the work, Hills Like White Elephants, is alluded to by the former. This allows for the great impact of context on the language use of a character to become evident to readers. In the scene for analysis, we find that the two characters have already been introduced to us earlier. And earlier in the story, Jig is a young woman, according to page 31 and in the first paragraph of the very story at hand. This woman has been traveling with an American, an older man, all throughout Europe. And within the story, we find that they are now caught in transit, leaving Barcelona when waiting for a train to bring them to Madrid. As they wait, they talk and drink alternately, and we are privy to their conversation. As already mentioned, the couple must talk about what they are to do with their unborn child. However, even beginning such a conversation proves awkward, as it is notable in the text that their age gap, the American selfishness, and Jig's naivete may hinder the possibility of a straightforward conversation taking place. We thus read on, even listen on, to the awkwardness that ensues as both parties skirt the issue at hand. The excerpt is as follows. The girl was looking off at the line of hills. They were white in the sun and the country was brown and dry. They look like white elephants, she said. I've never seen one. The man drank his beer. The girl looked at the bead curtain. Well, let's try and have a fine time, the man said. All right, I was trying. I said the mountains looked like white elephants. Wasn't that bright? And he replies, that was bright. The girl looked across the hills. They're lovely hills, she said. They don't really look like white elephants. I just mean the coloring of their skin through the trees. In this case, let's assume that the girl, Jig, is the sender. The receiver of her messages is the American, her lover, an older man. The message that she wants to convey in this part of the conversation in gist is, I don't know how to talk about the fate of our relationship and the fate of our unborn child. The context for her to even need to send this message in the first place lies in that she believes that they have gone through much together. There is an implied relationship as justified by textual evidence. In page 34, she says, we'll be fine afterwards, just like we were before. And he says, if I don't do it, you'll be happy and the things will be like they were and you love me. Take note that in these lines, there is an acknowledgement of a relationship due to the use of past tense and the references to a before and things like they were previously. In addition, there is an implied pregnancy and a pending abortion, which you can find in evidence again in page 34. The man says to Jig, it's really an awful simple operation, Jig. It's not really an operation at all. And he follows this up with, I know you wouldn't mind it, Jig. It's really not anything, it's just to let the air in. The fifth component is the contact that takes place between Jig and the American, and it is tied to place, particularly a train station that lies in between Barcelona and Madrid, where they are now talking and drinking as they bide away their time. Lastly, the final component is the code and can be found in the very words, word arrangements, and actions in the excerpt already stated. Now, after having applied the communication model in brief, let us move on and return to the greater context that motivates Jig to communicate in the first place, that of an unwanted pregnancy that must be discussed with her older lover. Note that there are mitigating circumstances that get in the way of her communicating with him in a clear and direct manner. He, for one, is older, and in addition, he seems to be the first person to avoid the discussion of such a serious matter. We are already well aware of the lifestyle he leads and that Jig follows through, one of a bachelor drinking it up, partying it up all throughout Europe. And we can assume that through the course of their relationship, they endeavored intercourse and this bore fruit. A baby, that which they must now discuss the fate of. In page 31, Jig begins by asking her lover, what should we drink? And he responds with, it's pretty hot. In this brief exchange, we can note that there is immediate miscommunication. Jig wishes to initiate conversation with the use of a question that asks for a specific response. Her lover does respond, but not to the question that was posited. Jig's agenda is palpable to the readers. She wishes to talk about the issue, but he, her lover, immediately evades this very discussion. And later on in the story, this is where the excerpt comes into play. After further banter about drinks, she mentions the hills that she can see from the view deck of the train station. These hills look like white elephants. And at this point, it is important to note what a white elephant is. According to the Oxford English Dictionary, a white elephant is an object of no use, is troublesome, expensive to maintain, or difficult to dispose of. And in light of such a definition, we can note that the mention of the hills like white elephants thus alludes to the child growing in Jig's belly. Now, after having mentioned such an observation, the American responds by brushing off her ever having seen one. Again, this is an instance when he, the older man, the lover, evades the issue at hand. Their conversation digresses once more into the selection of Spanish drink Anís del Toro cerveza for consumption. Intermittently, we can find Jig in the process observing, more specifically, looking at various objects. And there are quotations to attest to this fact. In pages 31 through 34, you can find instances where she is mentioned to be looking off at the line of hills, the girl looked at the bead curtain, and the girl looked across at the hills. And it is possible that such emphasis on the verb look in parts of narration allows for us readers to determine things about Jig's context and character. Clearly, she is in a position that asks for her to consider her lover's reactions. Contemplatively, she negotiates what to say in such moments wherein she focuses on objects, noting their characteristics as a topic that may lead towards a more straightforward dialogue about the child and the abortion. In these portions, we find that our character, Jig, is cautious as to the matter at hand, because this very matter is sensitive and cannot be rushed into. Now, going through the actual quotations, because we just endeavored a bit of an analysis of narration, we too find bits of context, Jig's context to be specific. On page 33, after a bit of fussing about the consumption and taste of liquor, the American says, "Well, let's try to have a fine time." And Jig thereafter responds by saying, "All right, I was trying. I said the mountains looked like white elephants. Wasn't that bright?" In this brief exchange, we can see Jig following through with her end of the conversation, unlike what the American does in the first two quotations mentioned earlier. In this case, she agrees and states that she has been trying to have a good time with him. However, she also elaborates on her observation about the hills, while closing the statement with a question. Right after her affirming her lover, "All right, I was trying," she too seeks affirmation from him. "Wasn't that bright?" And it is thus notable from this bit of dialogue that the girl's cautiousness, as dependent on her lover's maneuvering the direction of the conversation, is consistent and palpable to the reader. Lastly, on page 34, we find Jig giving full assent to her lover's opinion about the hills. Jig says, "They're lovely hills. They don't really look like white elephants. I just meant the coloring of their skin through the trees." Note that her language here, in this final statement, in this excerpt, seeks to overturn her very initial argument that the hills do look like white elephants. In this case, she directly says that they are not. They don't really look like white elephants anymore. In conclusion, such an analysis of these very few lines and parts of narration and the very quotations mentioned all seek to expose one thing. The communication as initiated by Jig is largely unsuccessful, as instead of being able to discuss the baby and the abortion in a straightforward manner, she is manipulated into conceding to her lover's opinions regarding hills, white elephants, and, by extension, babies. That these hills, white elephants, and babies are mere figments of her imagination and thus useless and troublesome. Indeed, the Jacobsonian communication model has proved its worth, not only in navigating the inner workings of the communicative process, but also in evaluating the effectivity of communication in the first place. Surely, context does have much to do with the will of the sender to send out a message, as Jig was wont to do in the excerpt. But her particular context and the language that derives from that very context does not ensure that the receiver will receive that message clearly and as intended. The same thing can be said about communication in our everyday experiences and contexts. One cannot ensure that a message can be perceived as intended, despite the accessibility of the very sender's context and the language utilized in the code, whether verbal or nonverbal. Regardless, it is amusing to find that we endeavor communication regularly, foregoing the fear of being misunderstood by whoever we wish to receive the messages that we send out. Surely, it is in our nature, as it is the nature of the very characters in literature that we analyze, to speak and even simply work with the aim of being heard.